we are in a new climate now from what we've seen in the past. The historical observations, the historical record back in the 20th century no longer represents what we are seeing now.
Hello, welcome to Climate Conversations. Now, every year the Met Office leads a report which is published in the International Journal of Climatology looking at the state of the UK's climate. And we've just issued ours for 2025. To discuss it, I'm joined by the lead author, Mike Kendon. Mike,
hello.
Thank you so much for joining me on Climate Conversations. Before we get into what the State of the UK Climate Report for 2025 shows, tell us a bit about why we write this report, why we publish it, and why is it so important?
So the reason we publish this report, the reason we work on this report that's published in the IJC, is to provide an update on exactly where climate change is at in the UK. So we look at the most recent year, and we look at the most recent decade, and we look at observations for these periods, and we compare them against long-term records that we have for the UK, observations of weather records in the UK extending back to Victorian times. And that is important because it provides us with this long-term context telling us how our climate is changing in the UK. The observations are from the land network of weather stations, so from weather stations like you can see here. This is a Stevenson screen from Kew Gardens, I believe. And why is this important? Well, these are taking weather observations at the surface at ground level. So this is where we all live and move around whenever we are outside. So this report is telling us about the changes that we are seeing in our climate that we are experiencing right now compared to, say, the climate of the 20th century, what we've seen before.
So, and it's really important to track those changes, so to help us see how things have developed and to get a better idea of how things could go looking forward as well.
Yeah, a key point is, this year's report is on 2025, so we are a quarter of a way through the 21st century. So this is a really good opportunity to take stock of where we're at. So this report is about observations that tell us what has already happened. It doesn't include model projections looking forward, although those are obviously an important area of work in the Met Office. This is telling us what has already happened. So these observations basically represent what I'd describe as ground truth.
Now, the report covers many things: rainfall, sunshine and temperatures. Today we're going to focus mainly on maximum temperatures and how 2025 stacks up against previous years, previous decades. Let's dive in then, and you've given me an array of figures.
Okay.
These are just some of the figures that are in the actual report. And let's start off with this one, looking at the mean temperature for each year, and we're going up until 2025.
Sure. Okay. So this is mean temperature. So you can see it's a long series. We have a lot of variability. But what is immediately apparent, obviously, is this warming trend that we see from the 1980s to date. We're warming at about a quarter of a degree per decade. We've just had the warmest year on record in 2025. Bear in mind that this series is 140 odd years long. But the warmest the last 4 years are all in the warmest 5, and that statistic would really be impossible without man-made climate change. So our climate is very much on the move. Essentially, what we are saying is that the climate in terms of temperature of the 20th century has gone. We are in that climate no more. We're in a new climate now. Our climate is changing. The observations that we see in recent years are different to the climate of the 20th century.
And you can see that quite markedly. There were fluctuations in the 20th century, but really in the last 25, 30 years, it's just been upwards. Oops, I clicked on the chart.
Yeah, as I say, warming by about a quarter of a degree per decade. We've warmed by 0.51 degree of a degree compared to 1991, 2020. This is for the most recent decade, and by 1.33 degrees, so that's a degree and a third compared to 1961, 1990. And actually, this is the 6th time this century so far we've set a new record for annual mean temperature for the UK. So we've been breaking this record roughly once every 4 years. So it at least seems likely that this 2025 record where we are now is going to be broken again, probably in a matter of years.
And these aren't the records we want to be breaking, really, are they?
Well, this is an indication that our climate is on the move.
Yeah. So then what's this table showing us?
Yeah, so this is really emphasising this point. Back in 2002, at the time, that would set a new record for the warmest year on record, 9.44. It was, broken again in 2003, broken again in 2006, broken again in 2014 and in 2022 and in 2025. So what we are seeing is we're seeing this rise in temperatures in terms of annual mean temperature for the UK. It seems likely to be a matter of years until this is probably broken again.
And also this column is interesting, isn't it? Because in 2002, obviously it broke the record at the time, but now looking back just 23 years later, and it's only 13th.
Yeah, so there
ranking.
are 12 other years, not just these years, there are 12 other years warmer than that, exactly. So
which is, mind-blowing just how warm it's been ever since then as well. Yeah, because they don't quite get captured with some of those temperatures. Now, this map looks at it in a spatial way, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about these changes spatially across the UK because we have a large range of climates across the UK. And I think in particular, I've talked about 1.3 degrees of warming compared to 1961, 1990. I think many people will hear a figure like that and think, well, what does it mean? What's the context for that? Because the weather changes outside on a day-to-day basis by very much more than that. So why does it matter? We might say, well, that doesn't sound like much. It's not much to worry about. But I would say the context of this is the range of climates that we have across the UK in terms of annual mean temperature. So, in fact, the climate of the UK covers a range of around about 8 degrees. This is annual mean temperature from the warmest areas in London to the coldest areas, upland areas in northern Britain.
Sure.
So if we think about 1.3 degrees, that is around about a sixth of that range, right? So that is quite a significant, that's quite a significant chunk of that. And if we move through this animation, can we move through? So this is 1931-60, 61-90, 91-20, and the most recent decade. And what you can really see spatially is the warmth, these warm reds moving further north across the UK, and the colder blue areas contracting back to the highest areas in the mountains. So we can say from this, our climate is literally on the move, and I think we've probably got another couple of graphics that go with this.
Yeah, so we've got this one here.
Yeah, so this is, in fact, this is a longer series because we're looking all the way back to 1884, which is when we have the data. It's actually gridded data on which this is based, going all the way back to 1884. This is looking at annual mean temperature. We've smoothed it out to look at the trends without the variation from one year to the next. But crucially, the y-axis is the percentage of the UK's land area. So how much of the UK land area falls within 0.5 degree temperature bands running from 12 degrees to 4 degrees. I think probably the previous figure, you could see the legend for that. So basically these are 0.5 degree bands for the UK.
Sure, so it's the same key.
Yeah, it's the same legend as the previous figure. But the key point is look how these colder areas in terms of percentage land area are really, really contracting towards the end. Okay, and look, here we are basically seeing or importing new climates effectively, so that this line is represented by 11 degrees. There's practically none of the UK within this area back here, whereas now we're almost up at 20%.
Well,
so this is a really substantial change.
I don't know which colour this is, but it's now at about 60% of the UK.
Yes.
Whereas in the past, before in 1984, it was less than 10.
There's some variation down here, but 10 to 20%. Yeah, so it's really, really ramped up. And there's another graphic that shows the spatial change. So here we are. So this is kind of illustrating this point. I'll go to this one first because this is maybe easier to see. So what we're looking at here is the area of land in the UK with annual mean temperature of at least 10 degrees.
Okay, and the different colours show the period when that was the case.
It shows the progress of that
Yeah.
moving north.
So in 60 to 91, 10 degrees, we're around London, some parts towards the Severn Estuary, a few coastal areas towards the south. But then in 1991 to 2020, it's much greater area where we're seeing that average temperature of 10 or greater.
Yeah, and it's expanded again in the most recent decade. So what that means is that if you live somewhere like the Vale of York, the temperatures you see now, certainly in terms of annual mean temperature, are more like what you used to have in London back in the period 1961-1990. So that's a big difference, a distance of maybe 250 kilometres. Our climate is literally on the move. And in the north of the UK, we kind of see this thing again. I've used a lower threshold of 8 degrees because obviously the north of the country is climatologically colder. And here you can really see the effect of this in terms of upland areas. This is related to kind of the warmth moving uphill as well. So it's kind of with the warmth moving geographically north, but also moving north uphill too. So it's a different way of presenting the warming that we're seeing in our climate in terms of a spatial change.
So things are changing massively. Like you say, the temperatures that London experienced in the past, they're now more widespread across the country. And obviously, what isn't captured in this chart, but we've shown it in other ways, is London's warming beyond that. Yes,
absolutely. We're importing new climates too.
Right, let's keep going.
Okay, so I guess a key thing here is how we experience climate change. And I'd say we experience it most through the extremes.
For sure. I mean, we're recording this now in the middle of our third heat wave of the year, and we've had, record-breaking temperatures in May and June already this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're seeing now in 2026 is exactly indicative of the kind of thing that we're talking about here. So this is showing the number of days above 30 degrees that we would see spatially across the UK on average per year. This is for the period 1931 to 1960. And then if we run through the various periods, 1961-90, 1991-2020, and the most recent decade. So we can see that now we see more than 5 days on average a year of at least 30 degrees in Greater London and more widely. And, 3 days, say, on average every year, going right up through to Lincolnshire, East Anglia, across to the Somerset levels, parts of South Wales, and so on. That's a really substantial change from what you could see before. As we see these areas really expanding across the map. And I've got an example time series alongside that for Greater London. I don't know if we can see that.
Yes, we can, which is this one.
This is the number of days per year on average in Greater London that we see, number of days over 30 degrees, so really hot days. And these data go back to 1931. They're based on this gridded data set called HAD-UK Grid. We have daily grids back to 1931. And the immediate thing I think you probably notice is 1976.
A famously very hot summer, and it really stands out then because there's a big spike in 14 days with temperatures in Greater London greater than or equal to 30. It stands out more if you stop the chart here, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas when you compare it to our current climate, it is still a greater number than we've had in our recent years, but it doesn't stick out as much because we've had some 12s in more recent years.
Yeah, completely. And I mean, I guess alongside that, the number of days on average over 30 degrees in London has actually quadrupled despite 1976
being in that data set.
And I think the thing I'd really draw your attention to, Alex, is not 1976, it's all these other years. It's all these other years in the 20th century with low numbers. These are years that we just are not seeing anymore. There are 1 in 4 years in the UK, 1 in 5 years in the UK's climate record in the 20th century where we did not reach 30 degrees anywhere in the UK all year. That's quite hard to imagine, but it's 1 in 5 years.
In the 20th century, whereas nowadays it just doesn't really happen. because even
Yeah.
these years in Greater London, it wasn't above 30, but other places
Yeah.
in the UK did. And I mean, I've only been a meteorologist for 15 years, but the idea of us not getting 30 Celsius in a year is mind-blowing to me now,
Yeah.
in the climate that I'm now forecasting in.
Sure. It's quite hard to imagine this, isn't it? Because I think we're talking about generational changes here. I think one way of looking at this is to say is what used to be extreme is now really becoming normal.
Yeah.
And alongside that, what used to be normal is now actually quite cold, you know. And that's where you're thinking. It's really, really hard to imagine a year where we don't hit 30 degrees in the UK.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, we do have 1 in 5 years in the observational record where that's the case.
From the 20th century.
From the 20th century.
But now,
but not
so
anymore.
much.
The last time was 1993. So this really emphasises this point again. This is the all-time highest station value by year
For the whole of the UK.
for the whole of the record.
And you can see, yeah, loads of years, or not loads of years, but several years where, I mean, 1910, the highest maximum temperature was around 27, below 27,
Yeah.
and lots in the high 20s. But yeah, in the 21st century, like we mentioned, a couple of years where it was a bit cooler, but just about above 30 Celsius around 2008, 2009. And yeah, it's just going up and up and up.
Yeah. So I think another key threshold we perhaps look out from this one is 35 degrees. 35 degrees, we've seen that in May, June and July, this year. In the last 10 years, we've seen 35 degrees basically every other year. This is kind of what we come to expect in a hot spell in the summer, right, isn't it?
Nowadays, yeah.
Nowadays, and we do have 35 degrees in the observational record, like in 1976 and some of these earlier years. But it's actually only about 1 year in every 10. So we've gone from about 1 year in every 10 to every other year. So that's quite a substantial change. And in particular, the gradient of this line, this trend, it's much more than what we see for annual mean temperature. So actually the hottest day of the year is warming a lot more than annual mean temperature.
We've got a chart that helps show that. Do you want this one or this one first? You take your pick.
We could go for this one first, actually. So this is an example area, Bedfordshire, in southeast England. So in parts of southeast England, the hottest day of the year is warming by maybe about 4.5 degrees. So that's 3 times annual mean temperature. So you can see this here. So the hatched line is showing the 1961-90 average for these two series. So the top series is the highest annual maximum temperature for Bedfordshire. The bottom series is the average summer maximum temperature. Okay, so average summer maximum, highest annual maximum.
And most of those highest maximums would have been during the summer anyway. But
yes, yes, they would be. They would generally be during the summer. But I guess the main point is this shading is showing how much warming we've had in the trend compared to 1961-90. And the warming here is much more than here. So the hottest days are warming a lot more
than the average.
Than average days.
The average days during summer. Yeah, you can see the change is much greater.
But I'd also say, look at the 20th century here. Look how many relatively cool years there are. This, believe it or not, this is not a data error. In 1931, in the county of Bedfordshire, parts of the home counties, there was nowhere that reached 25 degrees all year.
Which,
all year.
25 degrees feels, it's 30 odd degrees outside at the moment. 24 degrees feels pleasant, but very warm, really. And so for that to be the highest temperature for the whole year is remarkable to think about now. Yeah, it's pretty unthinkable to have a year like that now, but it's there in the observational record. And I think this is why, when we look at the evidence of climate change in the UK, it's so important that we stick to observational evidence, because these events back here, these are before living memory of many people. But this is, this is the evidence of how our climate is changing. So this really long-term context is very important. And I think it's fitting that this report's come out now during our third heat wave of the year, because people have struggled during the heat waves that we've had recently, because we sort of aren't used to it. We're getting more used to it with our change of climate, but many people struggle in the higher temperatures. but also our infrastructure just isn't designed for it. Obviously, we have a lot of old buildings, a lot of old roads, a lot of old rail. And if we look at the temperatures that were expected, when a lot of those buildings and infrastructures were put in place, they were built for those temperatures, not these temperatures. Yeah, and that's the issue.
Completely, yeah. I mean, we're saying the climate of the 20th century is gone, but that is the climate on which much of your infrastructure is based, as you say, our built environment is based. You know, our health service is based, agriculture is based.
Yeah.
You know, the ecosystems, you know, that's what they generally cope with. So if you go outside that, in particular with these large changes in extremes, it's going to cause a lot of very significant impacts. Just on the heat in particular, something I picked up recently at a recent conference is the impact of a sustained period of hot weather on the difficulty sleeping. So, you know, if you think you're struggling to sleep because your house is overheating, you can't get cool enough. That doesn't just affect your ability to sleep, because you can't sleep very well, and it affects all other aspects of your day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. So this has a real impact on people, and then in particular, you know, thinking about elderly and vulnerable people really struggling with these, you know, these heat wave type events. So what we're seeing here is really concerning.
Yeah, it is indeed. Then highest maximum temperature annual average. Explain this one to me.
Yeah, so this is showing spatially, and I've focused here across England and Wales really, the average hottest day of the year. So this is 1931-60. This is 30 to 32 here, 28 to 30 across here.
But then if we go forward 3 decades, it looks a little bit less red.
Yeah, 1960. I mean, there's some decadal variability as well. This is a slightly cooler period in our climate, I would say. So that is slightly less red. Not much, but it's a little bit less red.
But
yeah,
going ahead to 91 to 2020, and it's significantly redder even than the 31 to 60 period. More places in this 30 to 32 bracket, and some places around London, I'm guessing Cambridgeshire, getting in the 32 to 33 range. And even looking further north, we're seeing the orange and reds becoming more widespread. And then if we go to the most recent decade, and well, it speaks for itself, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, you know, this is not just one event that's caused this. I mean, we all think about 40.3 degrees in 2022.
Yeah.
But we had 38.7 in 2019. That was a UK record at the time as well. We also had 37.8 in 2020, right?
We've had temperatures over 37
We're over
in
37 now. So in fact, this year, we've had 35 degrees in May and in June. So it kind of shows the potential for this really hot weather to extend beyond, you know, July and August into June. I mean, we saw in June that happened in 1976 as well, but also now into May. And the other thing is, you know, this is showing maximum temperatures, but, you know, we could have similar comments for minimum temperatures as well. Minimum temperatures holding up at night. So May 2026, we saw the UK's first tropical night, so where the temperatures don't fall below 20 degrees in the UK ever in spring. And another key thing about these types of events that we see is the margin by which the previous record broke. And we're not just narrowly beating a previous record here. We're talking about events where we've exceeded the previous record by
several degrees. Yeah. And Now, we've talked a lot about air temperature, maximum air temperature in particular, but we've also had a lot of marine heat waves through 2025.
Yeah. This is based on a different data set. There's actually information about the data sets on which all of these graphics are produced in the appendices of State of UK Climate, for anybody interested in the details. Most of the report is based on the HAD UK grid data set, which comes from weather observations from the Weather Station network across the UK. But this is a sea surface temperature data set for a region of the northeast Atlantic and northwest European seas. So it's kind of a wide area around the UK from a data set called OSTIA. I can never remember in the Met Office, we have too many acronyms. don't we? But it's basically a blended in situ surface and satellite data set.
Okay.
And we had the warmest year on record in this data set. Those records go back to 1982. It's a shorter data set because it's
That's
a
still
satellite
several
data
decades.
set. It is. And this is showing the, for each year, it kind of shows the annual temperature cycle across the course of the year.
Mm-hmm. The grey lines.
The grey
little
lines.
grey lines, yeah.
So what we see, the hatch black line is showing the average value for 1991-2020. The grey lines is showing the kind of the distribution and the spread from kind of 10 to 90 percentile.
This dark grey shaded
Yeah, this
area.
dark grey shading. And the black line is showing 2025, and the shading shows when we were in marine heat waves over the course of the year.
Because it's greater than that 90%.
Because we are warmer than we would expect. And in fact, overall, we're warmer than that in a marine heat wave 4 days out of every 5. So much of the year we were in a marine heat wave.
Wow.
Mostly in category 1, there's definitions for how these things are defined, but at times in category 2, which is a degree above that kind of percentile threshold.
And the marine heat waves, they're impactful in their own way. Wildlife gets impacted, so we've seen increase in numbers of different species arriving and that kind of thing, haven't we?
Yes. I mean, I just on the graph in particular, I'd like to flag, last year we had the warmest spring on record. We also had the warmest summer on record. We had the sunniest spring, and we had very prolonged anticyclonic conditions, okay, across the UK. High pressure established, lots of sunshine, light winds, not much wave activity, not much mixing of the sea surface. So we see a kind of a warm layer near the sea surface, warmer temperatures, and you can see that this build up through the spring of higher sea surface temperatures. And actually what I find is quite interesting is you see these kind of that prolonged spell of warmth, and then a substantial dip here associated with the named storm Floris, where we get a lot more wave activity, and then that mixes up the sea, the sea surface with colder water at depth, and we see a drop in those temperatures back down.
And it is a marked drop, but even still, it's still above average.
It is, yeah, absolutely, and it's gone back up. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Quite quickly, it rises back up above. Yeah, so get into marine heat wave. Yeah.
But to go back to your original comment, which was on the changes in species, one of the things that we saw last year was a bloom in common octopus numbers off the south coast of the UK, off the south coast of Cornwall and the south coast of Devon. This is kind of the northerly limit of their range, and they're clearly responding to warmer waters, and that obviously causes some problems, for example, for the fishing industry. I mean, the Met Office is in Exeter. I saw 4 of these animals myself snorkeling off the South Devon coast, which was very interesting to see, quite amazing to see, but also thought-provoking too, very thought-provoking too.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Now, thank you for going through everything that we have done already. As I mentioned at the start, we focused on maximum temperatures, which is just one part of what the State of the UK Climate Report for 2025 looked at. You also looked at the change in minimum temperatures, didn't you? And we saw things sort of as you'd expect.
Yeah, I mean, the report looks at daily maximum temperatures, daily minimum temperatures, and daily mean temperatures. So we look at all those things. I think the other we've talked here a lot about an increase in these high temperature thresholds, numbers of days over 30 degrees and so on. But if we think about really low temperatures, instances of very cold spells in the UK, very hard frosts, we are in the same way seeing these basically dropping off a cliff, that we don't get these cold spells anymore, like we used to do, certainly in terms of frequency. So we do occasionally get cold winter weather. People will remember December 2010, the extreme cold there, the beast from the east in 2018. We do from time to time get these cold weather events, but they are becoming more and more unusual, less and less frequent. And as I say, in the report we have graphics which show the really dramatic reduction in hard frosts, the number of nights where the temperature falls below -8 degrees, for example. And why does that matter? Well, if you think about it, it might be good news in some ways because we might see fewer impacts from snow and ice in the UK. But there's a flip side to this as well. As our climate warms, we may have opportunities for more plants or more animal species to come into the UK. Now, these might be opportunities for agriculture, but unfortunately it might be things like pests and diseases. And the limiting factor for these might not be the averages of temperature, it's the extremes of temperature, the extreme cold snaps that would otherwise kill them off. So if we're no longer getting really cold snaps like this, there's a potential for more of these pests and diseases to come into the UK.
Which could be hugely impactful to, like you say, the agricultural industry and the cost of food, and obviously the cost of food's already much higher than in previous decades, so that's another cause for concern.
Yeah, I mean, I've said the climate of the 20th century is gone. If our agriculture is set up for the climate of the 20th century, a consequence of the climate having changed is that the crops we can grow, the things that we do, may need to change associated with that, and this is part of this question of adapting to the changes that we are already seeing in our climate.
Now, before you go, Mike, there's one last question. If you could give one message from what you found leading on this State of the Climate report for 2025, there's one key point that you want people to take home, what would it be?
Well, we are in a new climate now from what we've seen in the past. The historical observations, the historical record back in the 20th century no longer represents what we are seeing now. We're in a new world in the UK. We're seeing the emergence of new climates, and where we are now is not necessarily where we're going to stop. We're on this upward warming. I've already shown some dramatic changes that we see in these indices based on the observations. But I said before, what used to be extreme is now normal. What used to be normal is now cold. At the moment, the year 2025 is the warmest year on record. But thinking ahead, how will we look back at this year in the perspective of 20 or 30 years' time with more warming to come? So we can obviously influence that depending on how much more greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere globally, but it's absolutely clear, the evidence is clear that our climate has already changed and it will continue to do so.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you for watching this episode of Climate Conversations. We will be back with more in-depth conversations with various climate experts about how things are developing with our climate. Thank you.